Good morning. Good morning, Preet. Good morning, Dr. Brown.
Morning.
Good morning, doctors. I'm Jane. Thank you for taking the time to join us for our webinar on virtual biopsy of the metabolome with Metabolomics Plus profile. Some reminders before we start. Kindly put your mic on mute unless you want something to share with the group. Please reserve all questions at the end of the lecture. You may send questions or concerns through the chat box. Preet, Reg, and I will be monitoring them. If you wish to have a copy of the presentation after the webinar, please send to us your name and your email address through the chat box so we can get back to you. Today, we are happy to announce that Genova Diagnostic Metabolomics Plus profile has been redesigned with enhanced clinical utility in mind. This systems biology approach to assessment provides a virtual biopsy of the metabolome through analysis of key nutritional biomarkers. Insights from the new modernized report summary include customized nutrient recommendation that can help clinicians meet the precise needs of every patient. To talk about these tests, we have invited a guest speaker from Genova Diagnostics. Our guest speaker earned his degree at Kansas State University and his doctorate degree at the School of Naturopathic Medicine at Bastyr University in Seattle, Washington. He is a board certified by the North American Board of Naturopathic Examiners. He is a member of the Arizona Naturopathic Medical Association and the American College of Sports Medicine. He completed a CNME accredited residency program in the areas of naturopathic primary care and family medicine at the Holistic Health Clinic in Tacoma, Washington. During his residency, he worked alongside several leaders in the field of naturopathic medicine. In his clinical practice in Arizona, he delivers a blend of naturopathic and functional approach to help his patients with digestive issues, hormone imbalances, nutritional deficiencies, and sports performance. He is passionate about working with the healthcare practitioners from all medical backgrounds and is committed to the common goal of improving clinical outcomes for patients. Dear Doctor, it is an honor to present to you Dr. Warren Brown.
Thank you for that introduction, Jane. I appreciate that. It's great to be with you all today. Our presentation here is a biopsy of the metabolome featuring the Metabolomics profile. So I'm really glad to be with you all today. I'm the clinical science liaison for Genova Diagnostics. I've been with Genova a little over 6 years now, and I also have a private practice as well. So I'm just thrilled to be talking about the Metabolomics profiles. It's one of my favorite Genova tests. And I have a couple of cases to present that highlight some of the value of the test. And we'll use the first test kind of like an overview of the profile. And then we'll use the second test, we'll dive in a little bit deeper. And that's what I have planned this evening over the next 50 minutes or so. Here are some reasons why clinicians would consider ordering a Metabolomics profile. They are a wide variety of clinical conditions, including fatigue, chronic stress, chronic inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, digestive issues, hormone imbalances. Sometimes can be helpful to look at the metabolome as well. Mood disorders, sleep disturbances, and even some lifestyle aspects of health. We can get some insight by looking into the metabolome. We can get insight into the patient's diet. If they're interested in sports or just optimizing their health, the test can be very helpful. And nutrient depletions are another reason why you might look at the Metabolomics profile. And those nutrient depletions could be secondary to medications or to special diets, even GI surgeries that might make it harder to absorb certain nutrients. You can really use the Metabolomics profile to zoom in, so to speak, on the nutrient imbalances within the patient. If you order the full Metabolomics profile, it's over 125 biomarkers, and they are organized like this. This is a broad overview. The organic acids, the oxidative stress markers, the amino acids, the essential fatty acids are optional. The nutrient and toxic elements are optional as well. And you have the option to add on 4 genomic SNPs. So some fairly common SNPs that can have implications for nutrient needs, for increased nutrient needs. And we will take a look at all of this as we work our way through the reports, of course, but this is a very broad overview. So if you look at the individual pages of the Metabolomics, it's 13 pages. If you order the genomics, it's an additional 4 pages. But this is how it's organized. The first 6 pages are the overview and interpretation at a glance. Very nice teaching tools to use with your patients, where you can discuss the test results and talk about the most important needs. They're summarized in the first 6 pages. The next 3 pages are the organic acids, and the following page is the amino acids. That's followed by the optional fatty acids and nutrient and toxic elements. And then, of course, there's an individual page for each genomic add-on that we offer. The Metabolome is a really fascinating topic, and it's gaining a lot of attention. A lot of leaders in functional medicine like Dr. Bland, Jeff Bland, and Dr. Patrick Hanaway, and a lot of functional medicine conferences are beginning to recognize the value of the metabolome and the role that that plays in health. And it's defined as basically a group of metabolites that function as a readout of cellular activity. So activity in the patient's biochemistry. And this graphic on the right side of the page is a poster that I used to have in my office that showed the organic acid and amino acid and fatty acid metabolism and how those were all interconnected, and the involvement of the citric acid cycle. All of that medical biochemistry that we've learned in medical training all throughout. We're really trying to pinpoint different areas in that group of metabolites in order to look at the test and look at the patient from more of a systems approach. So the organic acids, the amino acids, the fatty acids, those are the metabolites and the precursors. Those are measured in urine and in some cases blood. That provides us the biopsy that we're talking about here today. And the Metabolomics report is the readout, the summary of that biopsy. A couple of concepts I think are important to keep in mind when thinking about how the Metabolomics works. Some things are measured directly. So if you order the fatty acid add-on, docosahexaenoic is an example of that. That's DHA. It's one of the important omega-3s. And it's a good way to determine the omega-3 status is by measuring that directly. There are also functional indicators of nutrient deficiency, which is more of the metabolome, more of the metabolites. And if we look at a given pathway here, just as a hypothetical example, metabolite A converts into metabolite B and converts into metabolite C, ideally. Those 2 conversions are driven by enzymes, enzymes 1 and enzyme 2. Enzyme 2 in this picture has a nutrient cofactor need that, if not met, will lead to an accumulation of metabolite B. And that is measurable in the urine. A good example of that is methylmalonic acid. So the Metabolomics combines some elements of things measured directly as well as some functional indicators of nutrient deficiency. Conceptual framework, this is another question that comes up often, is the test measuring intracellular nutrient status or extracellular nutrient status? And there are things that are markers of intracellular status, like the citric acid cycle markers, methylmalonic acid, the rest of the organic acids, and essential fatty acids, you could say are intracellular. Extracellular would be things like the urine amino acids and the urine nutrient elements, for example. And of course, the Metabolomics looks at both intracellular and extracellular as part of the assessment. All right, so hopefully that's a nice overview. We'll dive into our cases here. I want to mention at the bottom right, there's a note here. We have a support guide. The link is available right there. That is a link to our support guide, which we have over 1,000 literature references in that support guide. So it's a total of 1,000 literature references. And it's a great resource for interpreting the Metabolomics test. Let's get into our first case. It's a 59-year-old female. And her chief concern was fatigue, anxiety. She wasn't sleeping well. She also had some gas and bloating, so some moderate or mild to moderate GI dysfunction. She was eating kind of a Mediterranean diet, and she heard fish was good for her, so she was eating a lot of fish 4 times per week. She had taken a recent course of antibiotics, but wasn't taking any other medications. She was taking a supplement as well as ashwagandha because she felt like she had a lot of stress. So she was taking ashwagandha as an adrenal adaptogen and had family stress and work stress. She was fairly active. She was doing yoga 1 to 2 times per week, but her job was mostly sedentary. So certainly room to be a little bit more active there. But this is what her first page of the report looked like in her Metabolomics. And we can see here, when we zoom in here at the bottom of the first page, we have a scoring system that helps to identify the areas that need the most support. And it's categorized 0 to 4, meaning a minimal need for support, 5 to 7, moderate need for support, and 8 to 10 is a high need for support. And in her case, toxic exposure was significant. That had the most significance according to the scores here. Also, there was some oxidative stress and some mitochondrial dysfunction as well. Moderate need for support in those areas. Those scores are determined based on an algorithm that interprets the biomarkers listed below each score. That algorithm is weighted, meaning some metabolites are a little bit more important, some are a little bit less important in the score. And the significance of the abnormal also is taken into account. So it's a two-factor scoring system to help come up with the score. This is intended to be a brief overview. And I like this page because we're using a lot of the terminology that helps to describe the typical functional medicine patient. Oxidative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction, omega imbalance, toxic exposures, and methylation imbalance. The second page of the report is looking at the nutrient needs for each individual nutrient here. And this is also based on an algorithm. So the nutrient need for the antioxidants is in some cases, we're looking at metabolites that are related to things like oxidative stress and the Krebs cycle, which do require antioxidants, adequate antioxidants in order to mitigate any damage there. And that will become a little more clear as we work our way through the report here. But you see recommendations for B vitamins, minerals, essential fatty acids, and gastrointestinal support as well. In this patient's case, we're seeing moderate needs for most of the antioxidants, a high need for vitamin B2, and a high need for some microbiome support. So remember, she took a course of antibiotics recently and hadn't taken any probiotics afterwards. So there was some element of dysbiosis here for this patient. The amino acids are recommended at the bottom of page 2. And if we see low amino acid levels, you will see amino acid recommendations to correct that. In her case, it was recommended that she take some glycine, approximately 452 milligrams. Page 3 through 6, these are really helpful teaching tools. So the nutrient need is classified as a 0 to 10 in terms of the significance of the need. And there are some key points about each nutrient, the clinical relevance of the nutrient for health, in terms of health, and some food sources for the nutrients. That's also provided on these pages here. So if we take a closer look at one of those pages, page 3 is where the vitamin B2 was recommended for her. We can see her score was 9, so there's a high need for vitamin B2 here. And there are also some food sources listed there as the bottom bullet point underneath the nutrient. Page 7 through 9 are a pathway summary page, the organic acids, and that's sort of how these pages are laid out here, page 7 through 9. Organic acids are organic compounds. They help us to mark those biochemical pathways, and they are end products or byproducts. And this is, as I said earlier, it's what provides the biopsy for the metabolome. There are indications for vitamin and mineral needs based on the cofactors that drive those pathways. And it's because those pathways are driven by enzymes that require specific nutrients. And they are grouped into sections. So we'll see that in the next page here. Well, in the following slide, I'm sorry, in the following slide, we'll take a look at the different sections one by one. Let's zoom in on the Krebs cycle page here first. The citric acid cycle is here on the right side. This is the page 7 for this particular patient. We can see she's not having too much trouble metabolizing fats or carbohydrates into acetyl-CoA. The problem for this particular patient was mostly in the citric acid cycle. And that's where we see that there was an elevated isocitric acid. There was a high normal succinic acid, there was a high normal malic acid, and even a high normal cis-aconitic acid. And the citric acid cycle is driven by nutrients largely. There is one other thing to consider though. This particular patient has a pretty high toxic burden. We will see when we get to the toxic elements page that she has several toxic elements that are elevated, and those can slow down the citric acid cycle. So they're noted here in the red circles, but they're things like fluoride, mercury, arsenic, antimony, aluminum, and even others. So if the patient has a high toxic burden, that can be one reason why you see some accumulations or high markers in the citric acid cycle. Referring back to the first page, that upper part of page 7 is heavily influencing the mitochondrial dysfunction score, and the lower part of page 7 contributes to the oxidative damage score because a couple of things that we measure there, like lipid peroxides, which is all the way at the bottom left of this page, was high normal here. So there is a little bit of oxidative damage. We'll take a closer look at that in a couple of slides. This would be page 8 of her report. And generally speaking, in the upper left of page 8, you'll see the malabsorption and dysbiosis markers, which when elevated will contribute to those probiotic and enzyme recommendations back on page 2. And the reason for that is things like phenylacetic acid, when elevated, could be a sign of protein that's not been completely digested and absorbed by the patient. Other things like DHPPA, which was also high here at 17, is a metabolite of a number of different bacteria in the gut, but when it's elevated, we assume that there's some dysbiosis, so the possibility of dysbiosis. And with this particular patient, she had a recent history of antibiotics, so it's reasonable to put those two pieces of information together and assume that she might need a probiotic. The other thing that was interesting here is there are some yeast markers, and one of the recent updates to the report is we switched from arabinose to D-arabinitol. I'll mention that again in just a moment. We'll take a closer look at that, but just a brief overview here of the yeast markers. We see that all 3 of them are elevated. So that can happen after a course of antibiotics. It can create an opportunity for yeast to overgrow in the gut. And that might be what's going on here. Here is the D-arabinitol. I zoomed in on this a little bit so you can see it better here. But we replaced arabinose with D-arabinitol because D-arabinitol has a closer correlation to intestinal yeast. And it's a direct byproduct of Candida albicans, which, if it overgrows, can lead to a number of different symptoms, anything from fatigue to bloating to constipation or even loose stools. So there was a pretty robust amount of this metabolite, and given the recent history of antibiotics, made us think that there might be some yeast overgrowth here. The cellular energy and mitochondrial metabolites in the lower left of page 8 are essentially the same markers as the Krebs cycle markers. They show up here in list format. And there is one exception to that, though, and that is the alpha hydroxybutyric acid, which is somewhat related to carbohydrate metabolism, but it's really a marker of metabolic dysfunction. Sometimes referred to as a marker of poor lifestyle habits because it can be elevated in insulin resistance. It can be elevated in metabolic syndrome. And here we were looking at a borderline level. So not entirely elevated here, but she had a lot of stress, and I wonder when cortisol levels are very high, that can create problems with blood sugar regulation. The section at the upper right of this page are the vitamin markers, and these heavily influence our B vitamin recommendations. And what we're seeing for this patient is her glutaric acid was quite high, which is one of the markers that helps contribute to that recommendation for vitamin B2. So glutaric acid, in her case, had a lot to do with why we recommended B2. However, we don't look at just glutaric acid to make that B2 recommendation. We also take into account that B2 helps to drive some of the citric acid cycle, and it's important in proper citric acid cycle function. So that also factors into our recommendation for B2. But we know that glutaric acid is a metabolite that can accumulate when we lack vitamin B2 specifically. The neurotransmitter metabolites are on the right side of this page as well. And interesting thing here is that we're seeing homovanillic and vanilmandelic quite elevated, which is fairly common to see in patients who are currently undergoing a lot of stress. You won't always see those elevated when patients are stressed, but they are catecholamine metabolites. And so if we're making a lot of stress hormones, we often see a lot of the metabolites. The other possible explanation is that People with genetic SNPs in the COMT enzyme can have a difficult time metabolizing their catecholamines. And that may also be a contributor to high homovanillic and high vanilmandelic. The other thing is she was taking an antidepressant, and the 5-hydroxyindole acetate or indole acetic acid all the way at the bottom right of that little section there was quite high. And that's pretty normal in a patient who's taking an antidepressant or has a lot of GI dysfunction or has unmet needs for B vitamins or is taking melatonin or anything that potentially impacts the serotonin pathway could have an impact in the 5-hydroxyindole acetic acid. So quite high there. The metabolite itself, I'm not aware of any toxicity related to the metabolite itself, but those are some things to think about if you see a very high level. The toxin and detoxification markers at the bottom right, there are a couple of these that are elevated for her. The pyroglutamic acid was elevated. And pyroglutamic is an intermediate step in one of the pathways that's involved in glutathione recycling. So an elevation there often means that glutathione levels are not high enough, or the patient has a significant toxic burden and they're oxidizing and reducing their glutathione more quickly. Either way, glutathione support is not a bad idea to think about if you're seeing the pyroglutamic acid elevated. The alpha-hydroxyisobutyric acid is also elevated for this patient, and alpha-hydroxyisobutyric is a metabolite of MTBE, which is used as a gasoline additive in some parts of the world, and it is a pretty common water contaminant. So if we see that elevated, we think about water filtration to help protect the patient from exposure to it, but we also think about detoxification support, like B vitamins and antioxidants. The oxalate markers are in the upper left. These are new. It's a new addition to the profile. There are 3 of them there: glyceric, glycolic, and oxalic. And of those 3, probably the most important one is oxalic. And the reason is oxalic acid, when elevated, has an association with kidney stone formation. And in this patient, I think these are looking okay here, only a borderline elevation of glycolic, but this is a new addition to the profile, and we're pretty excited about that. If you do see oxalic acid elevated, it could be an indication that there's a significant amount of oxidative damage, or that the patient has more of a catabolic physiology happening. And this little graphic here, which is part of our support materials, we see that glycolic and oxalic especially can come from the breakdown of collagen. High stress levels could lead to more breakdown of collagen, and that could be metabolized into oxalic or glycolic. And then you can also see that that oxidative damage is a contributor to these pathways as well. There is a little bit of oxidative damage here according to the lipid peroxides. This patient had a moderate elevation there at 7.8. This is evidence of oxidative damage to cell membranes. And 8-OHDG, which is normal in this case, it's right on the edge of normal and borderline, is evidence of oxidative damage to the patient's DNA. The following page, page 10, shows the essential and non-essential amino acids. And the upper left are the essentials. We have to get those from diet or from supplementation. And they're important for building blocks for tissues and hormones and enzymes and neurotransmitters. All kinds of structural proteins and enzymes in the body depend on having enough amino acids. And the non-essential amino acids, some of them can come directly from diet, but many of them are converted from the essential amino acids. In this particular case, I think we're looking at a pretty good result there on the left side of the page. On the right side of the page, we have some amino acid metabolites. This was kind of interesting. The cystathionine was quite high for her, which is a transition point between methylation and transsulfuration biochemically. So we often assume that when cystathionine is high, that the patient may have some unmet needs for B6, they may need some methylation support, or they may have a SNP for the CBS enzyme, which upregulates the conversion of homocysteine into cystathionine. So it's an interesting marker. It's also part of our methylation profile. It's really kind of an interesting point between methylation and transsulfuration. Urea cycle markers and glycine serine metabolites were okay. Now, this patient was recommended, there was some glycine recommended, and the level wasn't all that low. But we also take into account some of the toxin and detoxification markers when making a recommendation for glycine, because glycine helps with detoxification. So even though the level is normal, given the entirety of the test, the whole test, and taking into account the detoxification indicators, there appeared to be some need for it. The peptide-related markers are at the bottom right of this page, and these are intermediary, well, they're a transition point actually between the protein that comes in through the diet and the amino acids that we ultimately need to break it down to. So if we see high peptide-related markers, that's a piece of information that we could use to make the digestive support recommendation for enzymes, under the assumption that the protein is not being completely digested and there's a buildup of the peptide markers. In this case, this patient seemed to be doing pretty well, and we did not have a strong pancreatic enzyme or digestive enzyme recommendation for her. The fatty acids are measured in blood spot, and really quickly you can get a sense of the omega-3s, 6s, and 9s and the balance between them by looking at this upper part of the page here, particularly the last marker in each section there. So the omega-3s, we can get a sense of the omega-3 percentage here in relationship to the omega-6 percentage here and the omega-9 percentage here. And it looks like she had a pretty robust omega-3 status. 4.4 is actually a little better than what I usually see, but she was eating a lot of fish and seafood. She does have a pretty impressive omega-9 status. I'm not aware of those being a problem when they're high, because they are important for cardiovascular health and neurological health. And the omega-6s were a little bit on the low side, but not terribly low here. The saturated fats were a little on the low side as well, but she wasn't eating a lot of saturated fat. Most of her fats were from fish or seafood. The monounsaturated fats were looking okay. We see a slight elevation of vicinic acid, which could come from dairy products potentially. It's not extremely high here. And then of course we have the cardiovascular risk markers. And she had a pretty impressive omega-3 index here. So she does have omega-3s that look a little better than average. And the omega-3 index, most of the published literature says we want to be above 8 for the omega-3 index, and she's pretty much there at 7.9. So pretty good result here on the fatty acids page. As we look at the fatty acid metabolism, I just want to point out that the enzymes that drive fatty acid metabolism have nutrient cofactors that we can see right here in the middle of the page. And sometimes this helps us understand fatty acid metabolism a little better. We'll take another look at that in the next report. This is also optional, the nutrient elements and the toxic elements. And the nutrient recommendations on page 2 of the report aren't able to take into account the nutrient element levels here. And it's because this is an add-on, so it's not connected to the algorithm that makes the nutrient recommendations. So you kind of have to interpret those separately. And if you have a patient who's taking a multivitamin or has a pretty good diet, it's not too uncommon to see some high nutrient elements. It's also not uncommon to see high nutrient elements when patients are lacking some of the B vitamins that synergistically work with the nutrient elements. So sometimes I get a question about nutrient wasting. Is the patient excreting high amounts of nutrient elements because they're not utilizing them? I think that may be more likely in patients who are B vitamin deficient. The toxic elements are on the left side of this page, and they're measured in urine, which provides us a pretty short snapshot. And in this case, she does have a high arsenic level, high gadolinium level, high platinum level, and quite a few others that are right on the edge of the green, the yellow, and the red there. So pretty high toxic exposure for this patient, and that is consistent with the score that we gave her on the first page. We also see that she has some difficulty detoxifying. This genomic SNP was added on to the profile, so COMT helps us detoxify catecholamines, environmental toxins, and estrogens. And she had a high toxic burden, and we talked about the high catecholamine metabolites earlier as well. A SNP for the COMT enzyme means that this enzyme isn't working as well, and some B vitamins can help support this enzyme to be a little bit more active. So for the treatment plan for this patient, we want to lower her toxic burden. We want to diversify her protein and fat sources. So rather than fish 4 times a week, maybe incorporate some other healthy protein sources. We want to talk about toxic seafood and trying to minimize the more toxic sources of seafood. Switch her to a higher quality multivitamin and maybe add in some B2. Riboflavin 5-phosphate is the active form of B2. She may need that given the need for B2. And also glutathione support is not a bad idea when you see a patient who has a lot of toxic burden, to support them with some glutathione. Glycine, 500 to 1,000 milligrams. This is a good example of how you don't always have to agree with every recommendation you see here on page 2. You can take some liberties with those recommendations. So for instance, 500 to 1,000 milligrams might help this patient with sleep and with detoxification. We always want to encourage them to manage work and family stress and continue her yoga practice or being a little bit more physically active. If she gets to the point where she can sweat a little bit more, that may help her to reduce her toxic burden. And Metabolomics in 6 to 12 months. That would be a reasonable time to check back in on things. You might see changes sooner than that. So if you wanted to check at 3 months, you could. But generally speaking, about 6 months is a good time to check in. Also, she had some GI dysfunction. So if she says, well, I've taken probiotics and it wasn't helpful, I still have some GI issues, some gastrointestinal issues, then GI-FX comprehensive stool test could give you some more insight into that. All right, that's first case. We'll move a little quicker on this second case. So we'll probably wrap this up in about 15 minutes here. But case 2 here is a 30-year-old female. Here's her clinical history. Main concern was fatigue, but she also had Hashimoto's thyroiditis and had some depression as well. She was eating a vegetarian diet, and she was taking an antidepressant. Supplements were protein powder and prenatal vitamin. She also works long hours at a very stressful job and says she has no time to exercise. So on the first page of her Metabolomics here on the right side, there you can see that omega imbalance was the biggest issue, but we also saw some moderate significance for mitochondrial dysfunction, methylation imbalance, and oxidative stress. closer look at those different categories there, we can see that just even from the first page here, that the omega-3 index was low. So she had a vegetarian diet, so she wasn't getting a lot of omega-3s. And it is possible to get omega-3s with a vegetarian diet, but this particular patient was having some trouble with that. We also see that some mitochondrial dysfunction was present here, and it looked to me like the adipic and the suberik acid had a lot to do with that. Of course, methylmalonic acid was also high, so there is some indication of a need for B12 just based on that marker alone. But it is somewhat related to mitochondrial dysfunction. Looking more closely at page 2, we know vegetarians often struggle to meet their needs for B12. That's one of the reasons why they're often taking B12 injections or encouraged to do so, or B12 supplements. So that wasn't surprising to see that one as a high need. Omega-3s were also a high need, and so fish, flax, walnuts, chia seeds, those were things that she was not eating, and they are concentrated sources of omega-3s. And we also saw a glycine recommendation for this case as well, but it was a much higher recommendation. It was 1,700 milligrams is what was recommended here in the bottom left of the page here. So a much stronger recommendation than what we saw for the last patient. Here's the B12 need. I just zoomed in on this a little bit so you could see some of the food sources, most of which she was not eating. And the omega-3s here, similar story. High need for the omega-3s. Here's the Krebs cycle page. And if we look closely at the upper left of the page, this is where the dysfunction was. So on page 7, these were the only markers color-coded in red. And it was because they were both high. And this is on the left side of your screen here, you're seeing a snippet from our support guide, and mentions that fatty acids are metabolized into fuel using the beta oxidation pathway. So this pathway right here. And in order to get into the beta oxidation pathway, they have to cross the mitochondrial membrane via the carnitine shuttle. And the carnitine shuttle is dependent upon magnesium and B2 and carnitine. And carnitine we typically get through meats in the diet. So she was not eating meat. So in other words, this is kind of a clearer example of that. Beta oxidation, we're burning fats as an energy source. Fatty acids have to convert ultimately into acetyl-CoA so that they can be entered into the citric acid cycle to burn for energy and make ATP ultimately. So that process requires magnesium and B2 and carnitine in order to happen. And when the nutrient cofactor requirements are not met, you could see high levels of adipic acid and suberik acid. And that's what we were seeing for this patient. So also from interesting finding from page 8 of her report was that the methylmalonic acid was high at 2.0. So it's not incredibly high. 1.9 is the top of the reference range, but because it's such a strong marker and well documented to be an indicator of tissue status for B12, it does have a lot of significance. And so it helps us to inform that B12 recommendation on page 2 of the report. So the serotonin marker was also high for this patient, interestingly. I don't always see that marker elevated, but it is fairly common. And this patient was taking an antidepressant, pretty high dose, and the marker was high. I usually don't regard it as a problem if the patient says, my antidepressant really helps me. I don't see it as a reason to discontinue it. I do see it as a reason as an explanation for why it's high. which can sometimes be helpful because we ultimately think about needs for B vitamins, magnesium, and even GI dysfunction. So if you, for instance, if in a patient with severe dysbiosis who's not taking an antidepressant, you might see those dysbiosis markers elevated in the upper left part of this page. You might also see the 5-hydroxyamyl acetic acid very elevated as well. And that might point you more towards dysbiosis as a cause. The oxalate markers, this was kind of interesting too. So food sources of oxalates are spinach, rhubarb, beets, nuts, chocolate, tea, wheat bran, strawberries, a lot of vegetarian foods. And those foods are not bad. I would say, it's not a bad thing to be eating those foods. But if you're having trouble metabolizing the oxalates from those foods, that could be a problem. And so if she's doing a lot of raw spinach, raw beets, raw foods there, that could be metabolized into oxalates. And steaming or boiling those foods can dramatically lower the oxalate content of those foods. And that may be a reasonable strategy for some patients. Does she need to go on a low oxalate diet? I don't think so. And I think the patient would probably be resistant to that because she's committed to the vegetarian diet. So I don't see it as a reason to avoid oxalate foods entirely. But it does make me think, how can we help her metabolize oxalates? And that's where things like healthy microbiome can be very helpful. We know lactobacillus and bifidobacterium can help to degrade oxalates, and that may be a strategy for her. The essential and non-essential amino acids. For this patient, remember, she was taking a protein powder. So as we look at the left side of this page, things were not too bad here. Certainly is room to go upwards a little bit. So, and it could be that her protein powder was a little bit higher in taurine. So that may explain the high taurine level. But they're not too bad, but she was taking a protein powder. Might have been a little bit light on arginine. So you could check the amino acid profile in the protein powder that she's taking. And if you're seeing low arginine content, you could add in some arginine. It's pretty easy to supplement arginine and glycine as well. We can see for this patient, the glycine level was lower than the last patient, almost outside of the reference range on the low side. The omega-3s are listed here. So we're looking at the omega-3s in the upper left. We saw that she had a high need for omega-3s, and part of that had to do with how low her omega-3 index was. So here we can see it's 3.8, which is outside of the reference range. And anytime we're trying to fight chronic inflammation with an autoimmune condition, I think it's always helpful to maximize the omega-3s. And I think it's probably a good idea to aim for a level of 8 or more for the omega-3 index. Because the omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, and autoimmune conditions create a lot of inflammation. So you could help to possibly slow some of the autoimmune process with an optimized omega-3 index. The toxic elements were pretty good for this patient. So only just a little bit of exposure to gadolinium. That can sometimes be a water contaminant. If patients have had an MRI at some point in their life, you might see that elevated if they've stored it and they're slowly detoxifying it. But it wasn't incredibly high here, and I don't believe this patient had a water filter. So that may be a good place to start when you see high toxic elements. TNF-alpha, this was a genomic add-on for this patient, and we see here that there's a heterozygous finding. There's a SNP on one of the 2 copies, we get one copy from mother, one copy from father, and one of her 2 copies had the SNP. Interesting thing about TNF-alpha is a SNP for TNF-alpha means that there's an upregulation of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And that puts a patient at increased risk for autoimmune conditions, which she had. Hashimoto's is an autoimmune condition. So that's an interesting finding. And in terms of the clinical interventions for that, we would think about things like antioxidants and anti-inflammatories generally, like omega-3s, for instance. So for the treatment plan for this patient, switch to a higher quality prenatal vitamin or a multivitamin and add an active B complex. We want the, she had needs for all of the B vitamins, kind of a moderate need or mild need for B6 and biotin, but often it just makes sense to support with a B complex. They are water soluble, and whatever the patient doesn't need, they will excrete, generally speaking. 2,000 milligrams of fish oil was recommended here on page 2, so that's a good recommendation. You could go higher than that if you choose, but we think 2,000 is a good dose that she could take long term. We'll consider that L-carnitine supplement because she needed some help with burning fats as an energy source based on the adipic and the subearic acid. They suggest that, so L-carnitine supplementation may be helpful. Glycine, she had a lot of stress, and glycine acts as an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which can help with sleep and in some cases mood. So 1 to 2,000 milligrams, we've recommended 1,700, so you don't have to get that dose exact for the patient to benefit. But taking it before bed is always a good idea because it can make some patients feel a little more relaxed or lethargic, even if they get too much. So taking it before bed is always a good idea rather than taking it before work. Switch to a protein powder that has a better balance of amino acids, one that's maybe not quite so high in taurine. Perhaps that might make sense. You could encourage her to steam or boil some of her vegetables. That could help to lower the oxalate load from those foods. And the antidepressant, it's okay for her to continue that if it's helpful. I don't see a reason to stop that. And then, of course, we always recommend resources to help patients deal with work and stress. That is, seems like I'm talking about that with all of my patients, and lifestyle recommendations for stress management could be helpful. Of course, you could follow up with a Metabolomics in 6 to 12 months. And you could consider an adrenal cortex stress profile to look at the cortisol levels for this patient. I would imagine that they would be high, but if some patients have, if a patient has chronic stress for a long period of time, they could get to the point where they're not making enough cortisol. So it's always good to check cortisol levels to help get a sense of, is the patient too high or are they too low for cortisol? This is just for comparison's sake, a comparison between the NutriVal, the Metabolomics, and the Ion. My favorite thing about the Metabolomics is it's a test that can be collected by the patient at home, and it doesn't require a blood draw at a lab. The NutriVal and the Ion do. Here are some additional resources. Of course, we have that new support guide, the NutriVal and Metabolomics support guide. That's on our website. We have video modules and webinars on our website as well. And there's a podcast with Dr. Chapman and Dr. Devers called The Lab Report. It's available wherever you can download podcasts, and the medical education phone consults. It is a tool that a lot of clinicians here in the US will use to get more familiar with the test. So I want to thank you all for your time, for joining me this morning. I really appreciate your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions if there are any.
So thank you so much, Dr. Brown. We now would like to open the floor for any questions. Please feel free to unmute your microphones if you have any. Would there be any questions? Just please feel free to unmute yourselves if you have any questions. Or you could type the questions on.
I will check the chat box here to see. Okay.
I don't think we have any questions on the chat box so far.
Yeah, I see. Thanks for the webinar. You're welcome. If there are
Okay,
no
thank you,
questions-
Warren. I think
Maris,
if we
I
don't
have
have
a
any
question, Maris.
questions,
Maris, I
we'll
have a
just
question.
maybe. Yes, Doc
Maris,
Oy,
I have
please.
a question. Yeah.
Yes.
With regards to the nutritionally essential amino acids, would that represent the protein intake, the chronic protein intake of the patient, or would you say the more recent protein intake?
More recent, that would be recent. That's a great question. And I will go back to that slide so we can take a look here. But it would represent about 24 to 48 hour status, which is important to consider when you're interpreting, because if your patient is not getting the same amount of protein from day to day, like with an eating disorder or for some other reason, that the 2 days prior to the test will be important to keep in mind. So
that would be good to correlate with the histidine levels, right? If you, especially for considering the maldigestion for the patient, if the histidine levels are all elevated, the peptides, what you mentioned a while ago.
Yes, that's another good point. Yes, if you're seeing the peptide-related markers elevated and low amino acids, low essential amino acids in particular, that could be a sign of somebody who needs some help breaking down their protein, whether that's enzymes or hydrochloric acid support. Either one could be helpful for breaking down the protein a little further. But I always think it's helpful to keep in mind those urine amino acids are about 2 days status.
One last question, Dr. Warren. What do you do when you're, because I normally request the Metabolomics or the Nutrival in conjunction with the stool test. What do you do when they don't reconcile, more or less, especially with regards to the dysbiosis markers, as well as the one that with regards to the microbiome, like in the neurotransmitter metabolites.
Right.
How do you reconcile that?
Maris. Pa-join
Right.
na.
Hello?
Okay, pakitawag na.
Hello?
Yes, I can answer that. So
Yeah.
anytime you see a discrepancy between the malabsorption and dysbiosis markers and the stool, I would put more confidence in the stool because it's a more direct way to look at gut function. And I think also keeping in mind the clinical history can be helpful, and you sort of put the pieces of the puzzle together. But generally, I think of the Metabolomics as an initial screen for dysbiosis and protein digestion, but the stool testing, a much more refined, much more focused assessment of gut function.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If there are no more
Okay.
questions.
If we have any more questions from the doctors. Thank you, Dr. Oy, for the question. We'll also send a copy of the recording of the lecture, just in case if you have any additional questions that you would like to send into Dr. Brown. You can send them through Jane, Reg, Mira, or myself. Okay, Jane, I think we don't have any questions.
I'd like to wrap up this session by thanking Dr. Brown for taking the time for his extremely busy schedule to be with us today, and for Pete for organizing the event. For those who would like to try our Metabolomics and find out how we'll create personalized therapies for your patients, we will extend a 20% discount for all the attendees until the end of this month. You may inquire through Mira Reg or me to avail the discount. Again, thank you for your time, and we look forward to working with you in restoring health through balanced, personalized, and measured nutrition. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you everyone for
Thank you,
joining.
everyone. Thank you.